Ted Bundy once sat in a police interrogation room, inches from handcuffs. They had his name, they had witness descriptions. They even had his car, but he walked out, smiled, and killed 12 more women. This is the story of every serial killer who should have been stopped. The ones who slipped through fingers, evaded instincts, and vanished into plain sight. The moments when justice stood at the threshold and hesitated. The detectives who saw the signs but couldn't connect them. The witnesses who knew something was wrong but were told they were mistaken. And the horror of what happened next. August 1975. A highway patrolman in Utah pulls over a tan Volkswagen Beetle in the early hours of the morning. The driver is calm, handsome, polite. His name is Ted Bundy. Inside the car, the officer finds handcuffs, a crowbar, rope, and an ice pick. Strange items for a law student to carry at 3 in the morning. Bundy explains them away with practiced ease. Tools for work. Items for a friend. A misunderstanding. The officer hesitates. Something feels wrong, but nothing proves it. Every answer sounds reasonable. Every explanation fits just enough. Bundy is released within hours. 3 weeks later, another woman disappears from a parking lot. Then another. Then another. The officer would later testify that he saw evil that night, that something in Bundy's eyes made his skin crawl. But evil, he said, wore a smile, and the law required more than intuition. Dennis Rader lived next door to ordinary people for 30 years. He installed security systems for a DT, the irony lost on no one who would later learn the truth. He was a church deacon, a Boy Scout leader, a compliance officer for Park City, Kansas. He had a wife, 2 children, and a dog named Lucky. His neighbors considered him helpful, a bit odd, overly concerned with property violations and rule enforcement. But odd wasn't criminal. In 1979, police nearly traced a letter he sent to a local newspaper. The postmark narrowed it to a few blocks in his neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They interviewed neighbors. They asked if anyone had seen suspicious activity or knew someone who seemed overly interested in the crimes. One detective stood on Rader's porch and asked if he'd seen anything unusual. Rader looked him in the eye and said no. He offered to keep watch, said he'd call if he noticed anything. The detective thanked him and left, never knowing he'd just spoken to the killer himself. Rader would kill 3 more people over the next decade. He called himself BTK. Bind, torture, kill. He sent letters to police describing his crimes in detail, taunting them with clues they couldn't decipher. He believed he was untouchable because he understood something the world didn't. That normal and monstrous could live in the same skin, that a man could install alarm systems by day and break into homes by night, that the best hiding place was in plain sight, behind a badge of civic responsibility and a face people trusted. Wayne Gacy was investigated 3 times before his arrest. 3 separate occasions. 3 chances to save lives. In 1975, a teenage boy told police that Gacy had drugged and assaulted him. Officers went to Gacy's house to investigate. They saw nothing suspicious. Gacy was a respected contractor, a man who employed dozens of young workers, a man who dressed as Pogo the Clown for children's parties and political events. He showed them his business records, his community awards, his photographs with local politicians. The case was dropped due to lack of evidence. 2 years later, another teenager disappeared after being seen with Gacy. Police questioned him, searched his car, found nothing conclusive. They apologized for the inconvenience and left. Gacy smiled and said he understood they were just doing their jobs. Gacy had already buried 17 bodies beneath his house by that point. The officers had stood 20 feet above them. In his living room, drinking coffee he'd offered them. He would kill 16 more before a final search uncovered the crawl space. One detective later said the house smelled like death, a thick, sweet, chemical smell that made him nauseous. But at the time, he assumed it was the plumbing. Gacy had complained about sewage issues, had mentioned he was planning to call a plumber. The detective never thought to look deeper, never thought that the friendly contractor with the clown costume could be capable of such horror. Jeffrey Dahmer was caught with a drugged, bleeding 13-year-old boy on a Milwaukee street in 1991. The boy was naked, disoriented, and trying to escape. 2 police officers arrived after neighbors called 911. Dahmer explained that the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend. that they'd had a fight, that the boy had too much to drink, that everything was fine. The boy couldn't speak coherently. He was disoriented, terrified, incoherent. He had visible injuries. The officers escorted them both back to Dahmer's apartment. They saw photographs on the walls, Polaroids of young men in strange poses. They smelled something chemical and sour, like rotting meat mixed with cleaning products. One officer made a joke about domestic disputes. The other radioed dispatch and said the situation was under control. They left, never running the identification check that would have shown Dahmer was a convicted sex offender, never looking in the bedroom where another victim's body was already decomposing. Dahmer killed the boy within an hour of the officers leaving. He would kill 4 more before his final arrest, 3 months later. The officers never checked the bedroom. If they had, they would have found a decomposing body in the next room. They would have found photographs documenting murders. They would have found evidence that could have stopped one of America's most notorious killers before he claimed 4 more lives. But they believed what they wanted to believe. That the well-spoken white man was telling the truth. That the incoherent boy was just drunk. That everything was fine. Aileen Wuornos was pulled over 6 times in Central Florida between 1989 and 1990. 6 traffic stops. 6 interactions with law enforcement. 6 opportunities to connect the dots. She was driving stolen cars. She had weapons in the vehicle. She matched descriptions from missing persons reports. Officers had composite sketches that bore a striking resemblance to her. But she was a woman. And women, investigators assumed, didn't kill like that. Women didn't shoot men execution style and rob them. Women weren't capable of that kind of violence. She talked her way out of every stop. She cried. She flirted. She played confused and scared. She said she was fleeing an abusive boyfriend, that the car belonged to a friend, that she carried the gun for protection. Officers let her go each time, never running thorough background checks that would have connected her to the missing men. By her 6th stop, she had already killed 5 men. She would kill 2 more before a fingerprint finally connected her to the crimes. One officer later admitted he thought she seemed troubled, damaged, someone who needed help, but not dangerous. He said he didn't think women could be monsters. That assumption cost 2 men their lives. The Golden State Killer raped and murdered across California for over a decade, leaving a trail of trauma that spanned multiple counties. He called victims before he attacked, whispering threats in the darkness. He studied their routines for weeks. He entered homes while families slept and stood in the dark, watching them learning their patterns. In 1979, a neighbor saw a man lingering near a victim's home hours before an attack. She called police immediately. She gave a detailed description. She even wrote down a partial license plate number. Police investigated thoroughly. They spoke to everyone in the area. They knocked on the door of a man named Joseph D'Angelo, a former police officer who lived nearby. D'Angelo was cooperative, polite, professional. He showed them around his property, answered every question, provided an alibi. They cleared him without hesitation, never considering that a former cop could be the predator they were hunting. He would commit 12 more murders over the following years. He stopped only because he chose to, not because anyone stopped him. When he was finally arrested in 2018 through DNA genealogy, investigators realized he'd been interviewed multiple times over the years. Each time, he'd convinced them he was just another concerned neighbor, just another ex-cop worried about crime in his community. He knew exactly what to say. He knew how they thought, how they investigated, what they looked for, because he'd been one of them. He'd sat in briefings and learned their methods, and he used that knowledge to stay invisible for decades. These men understood something fundamental about human nature, that people see what they expect to see, that politeness disarms suspicion, that charm creates distance from consequence. They knew the system relied on certainty, on proof, on evidence that could hold up in court, and they thrived in the gaps, in the spaces where intuition couldn't become conviction. Ted Bundy escaped custody twice, once from a courthouse library, once from a jail cell. Both times, investigators had enough evidence to convict him. Both times, procedural delays and bureaucratic failures gave him windows of opportunity. Who said? Them. Dennis Rader stopped killing for years, then resurfaced because he missed the attention. He sent police a floppy disk, confident they couldn't trace digital metadata. They did. Finally, Gacy was only caught because a final victim's mother refused to stop calling the police. She demanded they search again. She wouldn't let them look away. She called every day for weeks. They found the bodies. Dahmer was only stopped because 2 women saw him chasing a victim and refused to leave until police returned. They insisted something was wrong. They stayed at the scene and demanded action. They were right. Wuornos was caught because a pawn shop clerk noticed her fake identification and called it in to the police. The Golden State Killer was only found through DNA genealogy, a technology that didn't exist when he committed his crimes. None of them were stopped by investigative brilliance. They were stopped by persistence, coincidence, technology, and the refusal of ordinary people to let suspicion die. The most dangerous thing about these killers wasn't their intelligence. It was how much they looked like everyone else. They had jobs, families, neighbors who waved. They mowed lawns and paid taxes and smiled at strangers. They volunteered at churches and coached Little League. And in those moments, when police stood at the threshold, when instinct whispered and evidence hinted, the illusion held because we want to believe the monster is obvious, that evil announces itself, that we would recognize it immediately. But it doesn't. Ted Bundy once said that society wants to believe people like him are monsters, that we're different, alien, other. But we're not, he said. We're right next to you, and sometimes, even when you see us, you let us walk away.